The Seven Deadly Sins is a fun and crazy shonen fantasy manga that not only manages to build a world filled with mythological references and lore, but manages to tell an exciting story that'll keep you guessing throughout its run. Yet even with its thrilling story, impressive world building, and its amazing foreshadowing, those aren't really the first things that come to mind whenever I think of the Seven Deadly Sins. Rather, the thing that makes this series so fun and enjoyable is its diverse cast of characters, along with how they interact with one another and the world around them. Hey there guys and gals, Anime Dude here, and in order to celebrate the airing of the Seven Deadly Sins Season 2 alongside all the anime, I'm going to be analyzing the grisly sin of sloth, Fairy King Harlequin. If you end up liking this video, then remember to go check out my channel, where I'll simultaneously be uploading an analysis of one of my other favorite characters from the manga, the Fox's Sin of Greed, Bon. Now, without any further ado, let's delve into the analysis of the Fairy King himself. The understanding of other people's cultures and values is pivotal when attempting to understand them as individuals, and I believe this train of thought applies perfectly when attempting to analyze and understand the character known as King. In short, since King is by no means socially incapable when it comes to interacting with others, it can be easy to forget that he grew up among other fairies, and that fairy culture tends to have various differentiations from the values and general logic of humankind. Fairies have always lived naturally for hundreds of years, but humans have always had short lifespans. The fairies live with their entire race, but the humans are divided into countries. Humans spill the blood of their own kind in order to obtain things such as money, land, and power. While in comparison, it's shown that fairies have no concept of money, and I think it's fair to assume that the fairies also have no concept of power struggles or land ownership due to their shared residence in the sacred forest, where the sacred tree is said to choose the fairy kings. In fact, the differences between the two, as well as how they relate to one another, is actually comparable to the Native American Indians and the settlers in American history. The fairies live off of nature and were curious about a complex culture that they didn't understand, and the humans were filled with greed as they pursued what they believed to be valuable resources. In our own world's history, the settlers pursued gold, and in the world of the Seven Deadly Sins, humans were pursuing the fairies' wings. And though the deaths of Native Americans was the biggest genocide in our own world's history, and thus the magnitudes of events were on a completely different scale, what the fairies went through seemed a bit darker in a way, considering that most of the initial Native American deaths were because of the unintentional spread of diseases, and most of the fairies that died were essentially tortured as their wings were removed before their death. There are a vast number of differences between American history and the fairy-human relationship in the Seven Deadly Sins, and I simply wanted to use this comparison for understanding's sake. But regardless of any historical similarities to our own world, the biggest takeaway is that in the world of the Seven Deadly Sins, human culture and fairy culture are entirely different from one another. And from my understanding, how King views trust and the lack thereof was influenced heavily by their cultural differences. While bits of foreshadowing are commonplace in the Seven Deadly Sins, especially when it comes to characterization, it can definitely be an unpredictable show story-wise, and there aren't always hints given to help the audience prepare. Kinda like when this guy was actually this guy, who was actually this guy, who was actually this guy, who was actually King's dead best friend that he'd killed 150 years earlier. I mean, let's be real, there are two types of people out there, those who didn't see that coming, and dirty freaking liars. Anyways, we often learn more about characters through tidbits of foreshadowing, and while King's perception of trust is a seemingly trivial trait, it's actually linked to his past and ends up playing a significant role in future events. It's shown that King initially distrusts humans because they're always warring with one another over what the fairies see as the pettiest things. Despite this, his best friend Helbram let his curiosity and interest get the better of him, and he chose to trust some human merchants. As a result, he and all the fairies with him were betrayed in order for the humans to use the fairies' wings to live longer and make money, which, as we discussed, was yet another petty concept of human culture that the fairies struggled to understand. Helbram lived, but seeing all of his friends tortured and killed before his eyes brought about a hatred and rage that caused him to kill humans for the next 500 years. Once he met King again, King was forced to stop his friend that hadn't heeded his warning, and as such regretted the day that he'd ever trusted humans. However, while I'll save the reasoning for a later part of this video, it was at this point in time that King truly detested himself. As such, he joined the Seven Deadly Sins once Meliodas spoke of how many bad kings the humans have, and how in comparison, he could tell that Harlequin was a splendid king that truly cares for his people. At this low point in King's life, I think those were words that he needed to hear, and despite his distaste for humans, these words not only saved him, but made him grow fond of Meliodas. If you were to ask me how, I would assume that it's because people are more likely to believe in and latch onto words that they desperately want to hear, and the king that loathed himself and distrusted humans at this point probably had no words that he wanted to hear more than those. However, after the 7 deadly sins disbanded, and King returned home only to find the Fairy King's forest gone, he wasted no time in assuming the human greed that had tormented Helbram had also destroyed the rest of his home through Bon. It states that the humans working against the 7 deadly sins helped to confirm this fact, but he never necessarily trusted them, and only had goals that coincided with theirs. So I think it's safe to assume that King would have placed all of the blame on Bon, either with or without that confirmation. As such, his personal vendetta became to extract revenge upon Bon, and to do so in the land of the dead so that his sister could see that justice has been served. Fairies are shown to be able to read the hearts of others, and while they don't always do so right away, the fact that King doesn't in this situation shows that he was likely blinded by his predetermined discrimination against humans. It could even be argued that King's human form transformation is a representation of what he views humans to be like. In his mind, humans were and had always been greedy, and they'd always pursued longer lives, so of course Bon would have killed Elaine in order to obtain immortality. Yet after petrifying Bon within the necropolis, he was genuinely shocked when he realized that Bon's relationship with Elaine was different than what he initially assumed, and that Bon hadn't killed Elaine out of his own greed for immortality, but was rather someone who shared priceless memories with her, memories that allowed him to see her when her own brother could not. While he still has times when he struggles to trust others, especially those that he can't read, such as Meliodas and Gother, it was through the gradual understanding of what truly happened between Bon and Elaine that King was able to look past his own prejudice against humans and take responsibility for his own sins. Contentment does not mean to desire nothing, but rather it's when one is satisfied with what they already have. The laziness of sloth is often frowned upon, and in the case of King, it represents the fact that he did nothing to stop Helbram from killing large numbers of humans over a 500-year span. While we know that King was suffering amnesia during these years, and was thus unaware of his duties, he was still given the title of the grisly sin of sloth due to his actions, or rather the lack thereof. Yet even without considering the crime for which he was sentenced, the sin of sloth is a great fit for the Fairy King, not because of any sort of personal laziness, but rather as a representation of fairies as a whole. We've already discussed multiple cultural distinctions between humans and fairies, as well as how those distinctions impact their respective worldviews. But one aspect that we have yet to discuss is the overall lack of ambition within fairies. They struggle to understand the theory of competition, and don't quite relate to why winning is a good thing, or losing is a bad thing, in competitions that don't matter. This is shown to us during a side story where Helbram attempts to explain the human concept of racing, and in response, King genuinely doesn't understand the point of putting ranks on things. Only the fairy race thinks that way, and even giants have fighting competitions in order to determine their clan leaders. Yet despite how perfectly the sin of sloth appears to suit a fairy who doesn't understand the point of competition, Harlequin can be a hard worker, and it was partially because of the Fairy King's dutiful protection that most fairies became reliant and slothful in the first place. Anyways, fairies represent the sin of sloth, and they have been shown to have a distaste for the sin of greed that they generally relate to humans. But ironically enough, King is shown to possess elements of greed very reminiscent of Bon's, causing us to ponder whether the two are really so different from one another after all. You can see the video I just uploaded over on my channel for more in-depth info on Bon, but in essence, King is greedy in such a way that he wants to protect all of the things that are precious to him. Even though King is probably one of the strongest sins, protecting everything is no easy feat, and those that try often end up protecting nothing instead. This harsh reality causes King to end up hating himself multiple times throughout the series. His inability to protect anybody during his time with amnesia was what ultimately put him into a state of despair and self-loathing. And those feelings of guilt continue to linger in the back of his mind, weighing down his consciousness whenever he begins to doubt himself. One such instance of this was when he realized he was in the wrong for trying to take revenge on Bon. Another example would be when he was late to arrive to Leones and found Diane in a terrible state. King has always been greedy in such a way that he couldn't decide on one specific person or thing that was most important to him. But at the same time, I feel that this video would be incomplete if we didn't talk about his relationship with a specific giantess, one that always has and always will hold a special place in his heart. There are those who say that love may be one of the most powerful forces known to man, and the best proof of love is trust. But when talking about King, that could very literally be the case. During his time spent away from the Fairy King's forest, King spent many years living in solitude with a young Diane. During this time, he not only fell in love with her, but he promised her that he would always love her. However, after his memories returned and he realized that he had failed his duties as the Fairy King, he erased Diane's memories of him as he set out to face his mistakes. King's plan for repentance involved him being confined for 1,000 years, so even though he acknowledges to himself that his feelings for Diane will never change, he simply believed that she would be better off without him. After King first appeared back in Season 1, it was quickly made clear that he still loves Diane, as nearly every action after his attempted revenge on Bon is based around her. He entered the fight festival in an attempt to win back her sacred treasure. He disregarded his own safety in order to save her and heal her during the invasion of Leones. And he primarily helped to rescue Elizabeth because she was Diane's precious friend that had helped to bring them back together again. Also, when he fought by himself to save the Fairy King's forest, he used the thought of returning back to Diane as his motivation to survive the battle. Afterwards, he rejoins the other Sins with the intention of telling Diane how he feels, but is stopped when he realizes that Diane has had her memories wiped again. King also erased her memories at one point, and therefore acknowledges the hypocrisy in criticizing the perpetrator, but he is unable to forgive someone for doing so without any reasoning for their actions. The group as a whole set off to look for Diane in order to return her memories, but had they not done so, King was completely prepared to go look for her by himself. Diane is a constant priority of King's, and as such we as the audience have a clear understanding of King's capacity to love and care for others. Yet as we discussed earlier, King has trust issues. He trusts very few people, and that's because he finds himself unable to understand them. King has distrusted both Bon and Gowther because he misunderstood them. And though he was fond of Meliodas because of how his words saved him when he was at his lowest, he was never able to trust him at all until he found out more about him and his past. In essence, King's trust issues stem from a fundamental lack of understanding, and therefore he can only trust someone after he is able to understand them and identify with them. Taking this into account, King is able to trust Diane because of their connected past, which made her much easier to sympathize and identify with. Since trust is often seen as the best proof of love, I've come to believe that as King's worldview is ever expanding, so is the extent to which he is able to sympathize with others. Though there is no definitive proof for what I'm about to say, it was stated that Elaine's love for Bon was what caused her to finally grow her wings. And as such, I think it may have been King's feelings for Diane, as well as her reciprocation of those feelings, that allowed King to begin to sprout his very own wings. While his wings are laughable in size, he is already just as powerful as the first Fairy King, and I believe it's reasonable to assume that while his love for Diane continues to grow, so will his wings and his power level. King is the grisly sin of sloth, and as such he represents the general complacency found within the fairy race's culture. Since fairies have long lifespans, King is over 1,300 years old. Yet be it the time he spent with Diane, or his time living amongst other fairies, he has spent most of his life in ignorance of what was going on in the world around him. As such, his broadened worldview has helped him to arguably grow, mature, and develop more so than any of the other sins throughout the course of the series thus far. He is cautious of things and people that he doesn't understand, and it's through his increased understanding that he not only deepens his bonds with others, but relates with them in ways that help him to better understand himself. One such example of this is his relationship with Bon. The two of them were initially portrayed as a dynamic duo, but not because they got along. Rather, the two couldn't have seemed any more different, as Bon would always go around making a mess of things, and King would be there to clean up after him. Yet unbeknownst to the two of them, they were actually far more alike than they ever realized. King initially believed all humans to be greedy, and he thought that man's greed had caused Bon to kill Elaine. Yet as we've discussed, he eventually learns that the reality of the situation is very different. As he continuously bears witness to how Bon always acts with Elaine in mind rather than himself, he is soon forced to acknowledge and accept Bon. In doing so, he also acknowledges the concept of individuality, and throughout the series, that concept is beaten into his head again and again. He became suspicious of Meliodas once him and Bon realized he had a connection to the Demon Clan, and though they initially tried to deny it, that suspicion grew into a declaration of distrust once King learned that Meliodas was also connected to the Ten Commandments. I also find it worth mentioning that this little spat began with Meliodas trying to get King to look at things from Hendrickson's point of view, and to understand that he wasn't given much of a choice in regards to his actions. Since King hated Hendrickson for making Helbram suffer, he found himself unable to do so, and instead aimed his animosity at Meliodas. Yet despite his mixed feelings for his captain, he later regrets acting as he did towards him simply because he was a demon, and is reminded by Bon yet again that whether he's a demon or not, Meliodas will always be Meliodas. Even more interesting in this exchange was the emphasis placed on how Diane compared King to Meliodas. We already talked about how King embodies an aspect of greed sorta similar to Bon's, and while I'm sure my video on Bon will provide further evidence of that, I feel like this moment helped to provide some clarity in regards to King's sense of self, along with how that sense of self relates to the people around him. In essence, as the series has progressed, King has become much better at relating to others and trying to see things from their point of view. As a result, he no longer classifies someone as greedy simply because they're of the human clan, or as an enemy simply because they're of the demon clan, but rather he gains the understanding that each and every individual he encounters has their own circumstances they're afflicted by. This new perception of the world and the people around him is what differentiates King from Gloxinia, and allowed him to take a different path during the former Fairy King's trial. King's character arc is one in which isolation and ignorance are converted into acceptance and understanding through both the bonds he builds and the experiences he accumulates throughout the series. During his journey, King learns a lot about both the people and the world around him, and in doing so, he also discovers new things about himself and who he is. He is the grisly sin of sloth. He is... Hey there guys and gals, Anime Dude here, and I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to go check out the character analysis video on Bon that I'm going to be dropping at the same time as this video over on my channel. Also, thank you to Briggs here on All Day Anime for allowing me to help him celebrate the airing of the 7 Deadly Sins Season 2 with him. Remember to show him some support by liking, commenting, and subscribing for more of his 7 Deadly Sins content if you haven't already. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and Anime Dude out.